I always like to see the machines in things. I'm San Diego.
Okay, so let's get started. I wanted to welcome everybody to the first colloquium for the spring semester. Can everyone on Zoom hear me?
Certainly sounds good to me, Sumi.
Okay.
No, I can hear you. The
Yeah.
last advice you gave works.
Okay, thanks, Kevin. I apologize for the link issues. It seems that when things got forwarded, somehow the link got corrupted, but the number has been working for everybody. Okay, so it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Maureen Long from Yale, who's going to give us our first colloquium this semester. Maureen is an observational seismologist, and she holds the Bruce Alexander Chair in the Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences at Yale, and she's also chair of the department at the moment. Her specialty, as you will see, is in the dynamics of the mantle and using seismology, specifically seismic anisotropy, to try to study flow in the mantle and the dynamics of the mantle. Maureen is a highly accomplished researcher. I'm just going to give you a little flavor of her accomplishments. I'm sure I won't do it justice, but just in 2020, she was a finalist for the Blavatnik Award for Young Scientists. This is a national award, and it's given across life sciences, chemistry, and physical and engineering sciences. She was the McElwain Award winner from the American Geophysical Union in 2016. And that's an award given to early career scientists with significant contributions to earth and space sciences. And she also has been a fellow, a Kavli Frontiers of Science Fellow of the National Academy. She's been a Sloan Foundation Fellow, and she's had an NSF Career Award. She's been at Yale since, I guess, 2006, and has had over 100 papers. But I think what's really telling is that out of that, 12 of them are with undergraduate co-authors. And this brings me to the last part, which is Maureen is a really sought after speaker. She's also an incredible mentor, and she's worked specifically in, sort of making mentoring that is effective for women in STEM fields, but also underrepresented groups in STEM. And she received the 2019 award from the Yale Arts and Sciences for graduate mentorship. She, just as background, she got her PhD in geophysics from MIT. And then before that, her undergrad actually involved some physics. So she was, part of her undergrad work was in the physics department and geology. So with that, Maureen's going to talk to us today about the seismic wave field and what it tells us about the interior of the planet. So take it away, Maureen.
Thank you so much, Masumi, for that very generous and lovely introduction. And thanks everyone for being here and for the invitation to speak. I dearly wish I was there in person, but I have enjoyed my virtual visit. I spent some time with Masumi's research group this afternoon, and I'm very excited to speak to you today about some work that we've been doing, as Masumi said, using observations of seismic waves to say something about the dynamics of the deep earth. So I'm going to go ahead and motivate this talk by showing you two different, very much simplified views of the Earth's interior. So what I'm showing on the left is so simple that it's really a cartoon, right? And so this is a cartoon showing the internal layers of the Earth, right? So there's we have the atmosphere and the oceans kind of at the top. We have the Earth's crust, we have the mantle, and then we have the core. right? So this is the sort of very simple one-dimensional view of what the Earth's layered structure looks like. On the right, this is a more complicated view of the interior of the Earth. This is not a cartoon, but it is a numerical model. So this comes from a numerical model of mantle convection and flow. So this comes from Shiji Zhang's group at the University of Colorado. And what you see here is, again, a representation that comes from modeling using what we know about the underlying physics of mantle convection. So these yellow colors, these represent mantle upwelling. So these are mantle plumes that are coming from the core-mantle boundary, which is a thermal boundary layer, and rising up through the mantle. And this is a very, dynamic view of the Earth's interior in contrast to the kind of static cartoon view that we see on the left. So I'm going to come back to dynamics later on in the talk because, as Masumi said in the introduction, that's really what my interest is using seismic observations to say something about mantle dynamics. But first, to kind of motivate the talk, especially since I know this is mostly an audience of non-Earth scientists, I want to focus a little bit first on this very simple view on the left, okay? So again, this is kind of like the crust, the mantle, the core. I'm quite sure that everyone at some point in their education or career has seen a diagram like this one. And I very often show this particular cartoon view when I give talks to non-Earth science audiences. And I often get two very good questions when I show this view. Number one, how do we know that, right? Like, how do we know that there's a crust and a mantle and a core? And why should we care about the Earth's deep interior? So I'm going to give you quick answers to both of these questions. The answer to how do we know that mostly is through geophysical observations. So geophysics really is the best way that we, the best set of techniques that we have to understand what the Earth's interior looks like. Specifically, we can make geodynamical models of the Earth's interior and of processes such as mantle convection and convection in the core, which generates the Earth's magnetic field based on our knowledge of its physics. And that dynamic view that I showed earlier is an example of that. We can do experiments in the lab. So we can go into the lab, we can take Earth materials to very high pressures and temperatures and study their properties. We can measure things like gravity and moment of inertia of the Earth, and that tells us something about how its mass is distributed. And then lastly, and because I'm a seismologist, I think most importantly, we can observe seismic waves that have passed through the Earth's interior. Now, I'm a geophysicist, and this is a physics audience, so I've definitely stressed the geophysics angle here, but in fairness to my geochemist friends and colleagues, geochemistry is also very useful because we can measure the chemical composition of rocks that are derived from the Earth's interior. But for this talk, we're going to focus on the geophysics, and in particular, we're going to focus on observational seismology as a way to get at this. So that's the answer to the how do we know that question, and you're going to hear a lot more about the seismology aspect of this. But the other question is also a really good one. Why should we care? Like, you might say, well, hey, I live up here on the Earth's crust, right? Why do I need to care about what the Earth's interior looks like? And that's a great question, but it's also a question that has some really good answers. One, kind of obvious one is that we are affected by geological disasters, including earthquakes and volcanic eruptions and tsunamis, right? These are a manifestation of plate tectonics, which is the theory that tells us that the Earth's tectonic plates are moving around. And plate tectonics, in turn, is a manifestation of processes that are happening within the Earth's interior. So that's one reason. Another reason is that the Earth's crust, where we live, is produced by plate tectonics. That's how you make crust. We live on the continental crust. How you make continental crust is through melting and volcanism associated with plate tectonic processes. And so plate tectonics shapes our landforms, the mountain ranges, it shapes the landforms that we live on, and it also controls where we have our geological or mineral resources. So that's another reason. Another reason is to think about the other sort of aspects of the Earth system that plate tectonics plays a role in controlling. And maybe somewhat surprisingly, the Earth's climate actually is very much on that list of processes that is controlled by plate tectonics. And in particular, over very long length scales, kind of the age of the Earth's climate is buffered by plate tectonic feedbacks. And that is what has kept our planet habitable for the past, almost 4 billion years. Just to say a little bit more about that last one, because sometimes people are surprised to hear this, I'll say just a bit more about plate tectonics and long-term climate change. You might think, well, hey, wait a minute, isn't Earth's climate, isn't that controlled by the amount of CO2 that we're putting into the atmosphere as we're burning fossil fuels? And that's absolutely true on a short time scale. So over on the left, this is the very famous Keeling curve. So these are direct measurements of the CO2 concentration in the Earth's atmosphere made at Mauna Loa Observatory. And you can see that the CO2 concentrations are increasing, and that increase shows no sign of abating. And as we increase the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, the climate warms, right? So that's true today on very short timescales, but in the long term, on geologically relevant timescales, the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere is actually controlled by plate tectonic processes. So there's a set of processes where we have CO2 in the atmosphere. That CO2 in the atmosphere is going to combine with water to form carbonic acid that falls as precipitation, and you get erosion of mountain ranges and of topography. That chemical reaction between the rain and the rocks, as you have that weathering, that puts carbon into rivers and eventually into the ocean, where it is used to form animal shells. When the shells die, they form limestone. And that carbon, which used to be in the Earth's atmosphere, gets locked up in rocks, primarily in limestone, and then subducted back into the Earth's interior. And on timescales of millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of years, this plate tectonic carbon cycle actually plays a role, a very key role in buffering the Earth's climate. And we think that because the Earth has plate tectonics, that has kept the planet habitable. Now, this is not a talk about climate change, and I am not a climate scientist, but I do just want us to all have in the back of our minds as we think for the next 45 minutes about the deep Earth, that what goes on in the deep Earth really matters. And it matters for things that we care about, like our exposure to geologic disasters or the long-term health of the Earth's climate. Okay, so with all that said, and hopefully I've convinced you that the deep Earth is worth caring about, now let's talk a little bit about seismology as a tool for probing the Earth's interior. And I'm going to set this up by showing this very nice graphic. This comes from the Incorporated Research Institutions for Seismology, which is actually now known as EarthScope. But here's the idea. The idea is we have an earthquake somewhere on Earth. For this particular example, this is the Northridge, California earthquake in the early 90s. That earthquake is going to generate elastic waves that are going to pass through the Earth's interior. We have two different types of seismic waves. We have body waves, which pass through the body of the Earth, and we have surface waves, which propagate along the Earth's surface. And then even within body waves, we have different types of waves. We have P waves, which are compressional waves, and we have S waves, which are shear waves. The idea, though, is that these waves get generated by the earthquake, they pass through the Earth, and if we have recording devices, so if we have seismometers placed at different distances away from the earthquake epicenter, we can measure the ground motion associated with these waves coming in and impinging on the station. And that measurement of ground motion, which we call a seismogram, is a bunch of wiggles. So this over here on the right, these are seismograms from stations that are an increasing distance away from the Northridge earthquake. And each one of these wiggles corresponds to one of these waves arriving at the seismometer. So you can see the farther away you are from the earthquake, the longer the waves take to arrive because they have to pass through the Earth. And my job as an observational seismologist is to turn these wiggles, these measurements of ground motion, into insight about how the Earth's interior works. And that's a big challenge, but it's also a really fun one. Just to say a little bit more about the physics that is underlying seismic wave propagation, because this is a physics audience, I thought I would indulge myself and talk a little bit about the underlying physics. So of course, seismic waves are waves. So the simplest way we might think about them is by writing down a very simple one-dimensional wave equation. That's what I have here, where U is displacement, and we have, of course, a second derivative with respect to time on one side, and a second derivative with respect to space on the other. And then they're related by this constant C, which tells us about the wave speed, right? So we're all familiar with wave phenomena, and a lot of the the sort of instincts that you might have about how waves behave from, say, optics or from acoustics. A lot of that intuition, does hold for seismic waves. Now, seismic waves are particularly complicated because they're elastic waves. They're passing through the Earth, which is a 3D object. And so the seismic wave equation, which I've written down here at the bottom of the slide, it's a little more complicated than this very simple 1D wave equation. Here's how we get to that equation. There's two really simple pieces of physics. One is, of course, Newton's law of motion. So we can write F equals ma. And then we end up with what is known as the momentum equation, where we have a second derivative with respect to time. Here on the left, here's our density. And then over here, we have body forces, which we actually usually tend to ignore, at least in the kind of seismology that I do. And then we have surface forces that arise from spatial gradients in the stress tensor. Okay, so these are spatial gradients and stresses, and that's what gives rise to elastic waves. The second piece of physics that you need to get to the seismic wave equation is Hooke's law of linear elasticity. So again, seismic waves are elastic waves. So we need something that relates our stress tensor over here on the left to our strain tensor over here on the right, and that tells us about strains or deformations associated with the waves. And these are related in this very simple linear relationship by what's known as the elasticity tensor. And that tells us basically the stiffness of the spring, the stiffness of the rocks is going to control how the seismic waves propagate. Now, we can make some assumptions about what that linear elastic law looks like. One assumption that you can make is that the Earth is isotropic. So that means that the wave speeds don't depend on direction, and the wave speeds are the same in no matter the direction of wave propagation. And if you make that assumption, then this elastic tensor has a certain form, and that allows you to derive the seismic wave equation here. Now, the Earth is not isotropic, and Sumi gave it away in the introduction. A lot of this talk is actually going to be about how we can measure anisotropy, but you can do an awful lot of seismology with this isotropic form of the wave equation. And one of the things that you can do is you can make a numerical model where you put a seismic source, you put an earthquake in, and then you numerically solve this seismic wave equation. And so this is a simulation of seismic waves passing through the body of the Earth and along the surface of the Earth. Here are some surface waves here. I'll play this a couple times. The orange colors and yellow colors, those are P waves, those travel faster. The blue colors are shear waves or S waves, those travel a little bit slower. And you can see, just by looking at this, that wave propagation through the Earth is pretty complicated. There's a lot of reflections and refractions and diffractions to keep track of. So that's one thing. But you can also start to notice, even just by looking at this quick snapshot, you can start to make some inferences about the Earth. Now, of course, this is a model, it's not from observations, but you can notice, for example, that through this outer core here, we don't have any shear waves that propagate through the outer core. We only have P waves, and that's because the outer core is liquid. It doesn't have any shear strength, so you only have compressional waves. And again, this is a model, but we can make inferences from measurements of the seismic wave field that tell us that the Earth has a core and that the outer core is liquid because we don't see shear waves propagating through it. So that's just a little bit about the underlying physics. And really now for the rest of the talk, I'm really going to tell you more about kind of techniques and results. So with that intro to the seismic wave equation, what can we do with observational seismology? What kind of things you can do? I teach an entire semester long course on this question, so I'm only going to be able to give you a flavor in a few minutes. But one of the things we can do is something called seismic tomography. And this is very analogous to medical tomography. So this is a CT scan of a person's brain, and we've all seen this kind of example before in medical applications. We can do something very similar with seismic waves. And in fact, this is work done at UNM from Brandon Schmant from his group, and Fanchi Lin, his collaborator. So this is what I'm showing here. This is a seismic tomography model of North America. So this was derived from observations of body wave travel times made at seismic stations on the North American continent. And we can invert those observations for a model of seismic wave speed variations, okay? So these are two map view slices, one at 75 kilometer depth, so that's kind of in the uppermost part of the mantle below the crust, and then one a little deeper down at 200 kilometers depth. So the way to read this, and I just realized I accidentally took the color bar off, but the way to read this is the blue colors mean that the waves travel a little bit faster than average, and the red colors mean that they travel a little bit slower than average. And these variations we think are often telling us about temperature. So cold rocks have faster wave speeds and hotter rocks, warmer rocks have slower wave speeds. So just from that, you can look at these maps and I at least get really intrigued about what it is that we're seeing. You know, one thing that you can see is this sort of first order difference between the continental interior. These are the old rocks in the continental interior. They're faster than average. And then out here, you come into the more tectonically active Western US, which is close to a plate boundary out here. And the rocks in general are hotter and there's more going on and there's more dynamics. And so again, I can look at this all day. Your eye may be drawn to the parts of the model where you guys are, where you live in New Mexico. And so you can see that there's these, you know, slow anomalies. There's actually sort of almost like a ring of slow anomalies surrounding the Colorado Plateau. And Masumi has done a lot of work on what those might mean and how the Colorado Plateau has evolved. My eye always goes to the eastern part of North America because that's where I'm from and where I live now. And you'll notice that here in the east, there are actually a couple of prominent slow velocity anomalies that I actually spend a lot of my time thinking about, but that's not the topic of today's talk. Ask me about it later if you're interested. So seismic tomography is one thing that we can do with seismic waves. Another thing that we can do with seismic waves is look at seismic anisotropy. So we can look at how the wave speeds depend on direction. And in one more slide, I'm going to tell you why that's important. But for now, I'm going to talk about how seismic anisotropy manifests itself in the seismic wave field, or one of the ways it manifests itself in the seismic wave field. And that's through a phenomenon that we call shear wave splitting or shear wave birefringence. So the idea is that you have a shear wave, it's polarized, it has an initial polarization in a certain direction. It's propagating through an anisotropic medium. When it hits the anisotropic medium, it splits into two quasi-shear waves that are traveling at different directions because the medium is anisotropic. So one wave is traveling faster, that's the blue one, and the other wave is traveling slower, that's the red one. This is completely analogous to optical birefringence in a crystal under polarized light, if you've ever seen that. It's the same phenomenon with seismic waves. And this is something that we can measure. We can look on a seismogram, we can look at the polarizations of the shear wave or the shear waves if it's been split, and we can say, aha, there's anisotropy here. And we can use the orientation of that fast polarized wave to say something about the geometry of anisotropy, and we can use the delay time between the fast and the slow waves to say something about the strength of anisotropy. So anisotropy is a very complicated phenomenon. When you go back to that equation and where we have our elastic tensor, when we have 21 independent components instead of 2 independent components, wave propagation gets very complicated, but there are lots of ways of representing this. One way of representing it is over here on the right. This is kind of a stereographic projection of the difference between the fast and slow quasi-S wave propagation speeds for different directions. So where you see red colors, in that direction, there's weak S-wave anisotropy and not much or any shear wave splitting. Where you see the blue colors, there's stronger anisotropy and stronger shear wave splitting. And this is also, for this particular elastic tensor, making predictions about what the fast shear polarization direction is. So I'm showing you this because I'm going to show later on in the talk a few different diagrams that look like this. Okay, so hopefully I've convinced you that we can look at seismic waves and sort of see the signature of seismic anisotropy and say something about this directional dependence of seismic wave speeds. You might reasonably ask, why is that interesting, Maureen? Like, why would one do that? And I'm going to tell you, this is maybe the most important slide in the entire talk, so listen up. The reason we care about seismic anisotropy is because it tells us something about mantle dynamics. Remember that cartoon that I showed on the very first slide, that animation I showed, a model of mantle convection. That model that is running forward in time over probably hundreds of millions of years. we live on the Earth today, right? We can't wait around for 100 million years to watch the convection currents. We need to be able to make some observations today that shed light on these dynamic processes that are happening in Earth over very long time scales. And seismic anisotropy gives us a tool for that. Let me explain. The idea here is that in the mantle, at least under certain conditions, when you have mantle flow due to convection, or any process that deforms your rock, that changes the shape of your rock over very long time scales. This is not the sort of instantaneous elastic deformation. This is now plastic deformation of mantle rocks over very long time scales. When you deform a rock, it turns out that the individual mineral crystals in that rock tend to rotate and align, often in the direction of shearing, okay? So the idea here is you have some kind of mantle flow, and if there's a gradient in your flow velocities, that's going to give you deformation. The individual mineral crystals in the rocks that make up the mantle will tend to generate a statistically preferred alignment. And because those individual mineral crystals themselves have anisotropy, that means that your rock, your mantle, is going to look anisotropic to seismic waves. And so over on the right, this is another version of what I showed on the last slide. We have a seismic wave coming up beneath the seismic station. It's splitting into two components, and we measure the orientation of the fast direction and the delay time, okay? The fact that there is this causative link between mantle flow and mantle deformation and the resulting anisotropy is extremely powerful, because that means that we have something that we can measure in the seismic wave field that tells us about how the mantle is flowing, even though that mantle flow is taking place on timescales of, millions, tens of millions of years. So this is a really powerful way for us to use observations of the present day seismic wave fields to tell us something about mantle dynamics. And that's why I have spent much of my career thinking about how do we measure seismic anisotropy in the Earth? What can it tell us about dynamics? So with all of that said, let's talk a little bit about what we can do in the deep mantle. All right, this is, I forgot I put this slide in here. This is just to remind me to say that these observations of shear wave splitting are now a pretty routine piece of seismic analysis, okay? So now I want to tell you a little bit about the deep mantle, why it is wonderful, why it is weird, and what are our big outstanding puzzles, okay? So this is a cartoon view. It's a cartoon, but it's informed by tomographic models of the mantle, okay? And this is a cartoon view of some of the structures and processes that we think might be going on in the deepest mantle near the core mantle boundary, all right? And I've put down here just a little glossary for you. I know there's a lot of terms on this cartoon that are not familiar. What do we see? So this blue feature, this is meant to represent a subducting slab that is coming down from the shallow, from the surface. It's subducting, it's sinking into the mantle because it's dense, it's heavy, it wants to go down. And that shows up in our seismic tomography models as a blue thing. So we have slabs that are coming down and impinging on the core mantle boundary. We also have structures that we can image in seismic tomography that are slow compared to the background mantle. We call them large low shear velocity provinces, or LLSVPs. I'm going to say a little more about them on the next slide. These are structures that are pretty enigmatic. We can image them with seismic tomography. We do not know what they are and how they are formed and how they interact with mantle flow. So that's a big outstanding question. We also have signatures of seismic features that we think might be related to mineralogical phase changes. So most of the lower mantle is dominated by a mineral called bridgmanite or perovskite. But at the base of the mantle, we think it undergoes a high pressure phase transformation to what's called post-perovskite. So we have interesting mineral phase transitions. We also have what are known as ULVZs. These are not the most imaginative acronyms, but this stands for ultra low velocity zones. So these are thin little pockets of very low velocity material. And again, we really don't know what they are, okay? So this is just a quick introduction to some of the structures that we might see and some of the terminology I might use. And yes, notably, when I say CMB, it means core mantle boundary. It does not mean cosmic microwave background. So just to throw that out there. Okay, so I've introduced the idea of these LLSVPs, and I've introduced these ultra low velocity zones. So I'm going to say a little bit more about these things and where they are and what they might be. So first, the LLSVPs, or sometimes people just call them LLVPs, large low velocity provinces. So there are two of these. So what I'm showing here, this is a map view of a seismic tomography model now at the base of the mantle. So this is just above the core-mantle boundary, or CMB. And you can see there are these two prominent regions of slow velocities. So they show up as red in the tomography models. One is directly, sort of more or less directly beneath Africa. I think you can hopefully see the outlines of the land. So here's the African continent. So one of them is right beneath Africa. Sometimes this one is affectionately known as Tuzo. This one is affectionately known as Jason. But the other one is directly beneath the Pacific Ocean. So there are these two prominent slow structures. They're roughly antipodal. They're roughly on opposite sides of the Earth. And we really do not know yet what they are, why they're there, whether these are structures that have like persisted over the age of the Earth and they've always been there, or are they kind of transient structures that change over the age of the Earth? We really don't know. One thing we do know is that there is a spatial association between these slow features and mantle plumes that come up as hotspot volcanism. So Hawaii is the most famous hotspot that many people have heard of. And you'll see that Hawaii lies right on the edge of this Pacific LLSVP. Many of the other hotspot mantle plumes that we know of fall either on the edges or maybe on the interiors of these structures. So there seems to be a link between hotspot volcanism and these LLVPs or LLSVPs. So that's the LLSVPs. What about these ULVZ things? What are they? So again, ULVZ, ultra low velocity zones. So these are features that are quite small. They're directly above the CMB, and they're associated with a very drastic reduction in velocity. Usually we're looking at a shear velocity. So they might be 20 or 30% slower than the stuff around it. So they're made of different stuff, but again, we don't know exactly what they're made of. So this is just again, kind of a cartoon view of what these are. They're very thin. Some of them, they're probably only like 10 or 20 kilometers thick. We think our detection limit is probably about 5 kilometers. They might extend for hundreds of kilometers. And if you look at, this is a figure that shows where they show up in map view. So all of the red bits are where people have found ULVZs. And you kind of tilt your head a little bit and look at it at exactly the right angle, you might notice that the ULVZs, many of them are along the boundaries or in the interior of the LLSVP structures, but many of them are not. And so we're still grappling with the question of like, what are these things? What are they made of? Why are they there? And is there any relationship between their distribution and the LLSVP distribution? Okay, so with all that said, as a sort of deep earth seismologist, I think there is a huge range of really interested unanswered questions relating to the lowermost mantle, the core-mantle boundary region. What are these things made of? What are these features? What are LLSVPs? What are ULVZs? What are they made of? Are they stationary or do they move around? How old are they? Are they long-lived, persistent features, or are they transient? What do they tell us about deep earth dynamics and how mantle flow, how do the mantle flow associated with these structures affect the processes at the surface? Does mantle flow and convection in the mantle, remember that movie I showed at the beginning, does it play a role in shaping these structures or maybe moving them around? What does the pattern of flow look like at the base of the mantle, and what drives that flow? So for the rest of the talk, the next 15 minutes or so, I'm going to tell you about some results that we've gotten in my group looking at seismic anisotropy at the base of the mantle to try to get at some of these questions. So I'm going to briefly take you through some results from 3 different studies. I'm not going to get into the technical details of these studies. I'm really going to tell you about results. But I do just want to emphasize that deep mantle anisotropy, it's a lot harder to study than anisotropy shallower in the Earth's mantle. And the advances that I'm going to kind of talk about have been set up by a bunch of different ingredients. We have new observational techniques and strategies to measure anisotropy in the deep mantle. We have new dense and high quality seismic data sets that really let us dive into the details. We have new results from mineral physics. We have new computational approaches for simulating seismic waveforms and comparing model predictions to our observations. And we also collaborate quite a bit with mineral physicists and geodynamical modelers. So with all that said, here's a quick tour of some cool results that we've gotten recently in my group using this anisotropy tool. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is the African LLSVP. So this is one of these two large, low shear velocity provinces at the base of the mantle. And an observation that's been out there actually for a while in the literature is the suggestion that they might have anisotropy in D double prime, which is the base of the mantle, the lowermost layer, concentrated at the edges of the LLSVPs. And if that's true, that's interesting because that might tell us something about their dynamics. If you are concentrating strain and deformation at the edges of these things, that might tell us something about how they behave. Maybe they're strong and they're resistant to deformation. So when you have mantle flow around them, you concentrate deformation at their edges. So there have been a couple of previous studies, and I'm not going to talk through these figures in detail, but there have been a couple of previous studies that have suggested that you might have strong anisotropy at the edges of the African LLSVP. So a few years ago, a postdoc of mine, Miriam Rice, who's now in Frankfurt, we decided to test this idea using a data set that was basically an order of magnitude bigger than any of the previous studies had used. So this is a map of all of the seismic stations in Africa and the surrounding regions that Miriam used to look at this question. Now, you'll notice that the station distribution is very uneven. Parts of Africa are very well instrumented, and then vast swaths of Africa are not at all instrumented, but you do what you can with the data. So the way we decided to look at this is using two seismic phases, and these showed up in those movies that I showed before. One is called SKS, so this is a wave that is a shear wave, and then it's a P wave in the liquid outer core, and then it converts back to a shear wave. So that's the SKS phase, and then it has a sister phase known as SKKS, so that's the yellow one here. It's the same thing, but it has a little extra underside reflection at the CMB, okay? So here's SKS, here's SKKS. The idea is if we go out and measure the splitting of both of these phases, so if we measure their anisotropy, if those splitting measurements look the same, then we can say, well, okay, probably those passed through anisotropy right beneath the station, where these two types of waves have very similar paths. But if you measure the splitting of these two phases and they're different, they sample slightly different pieces of the mantle right above the CMB. So if they're different, that tells us that there's anisotropy in the deep mantle. And so what Miriam did was she took data from all of these stations and she measured tens of thousands of these phases. She looked at their splitting. So she looked at those shear wave polarizations and figured out which ones were split, which ones were not split, and how much. And she was able to put together a huge and extremely impressive data set of what we call these SKS, SKKS splitting intensity discrepancies. Basically what you need to know, this is an anisotropy detector, where we see differences in these, where we see these strong discrepancies, differences in these two phases. So where you see the dark colors on this map, that means there's anisotropy, okay? So Miriam put together this huge data set. It's actually so huge, I can't show it on one figure. So this is just one slice of ray paths coming from a certain direction. And again, these are these lines are showing the parts of the core-mantle boundary that these phases are sampling, and the color of the line shows how different their splitting is. So dark colors, very good evidence for seismic anisotropy. So Miriam put together this huge data set. Over here on the right, I'm plotting just the measurements she made that are different. So this is the anisotropy detector. So all of these lines on this right plot, we found anisotropy. And again, the darker the color, the stronger the anisotropy. And what Miriam found with, again, a much bigger data set is that, yes, the idea that we have anisotropy concentrated at the LLSVP edges, that does seem to hold up. Most of the paths that we have in the interior of the LLSVP did not show evidence for anisotropy, and a lot of the ones that sampled near the edge did show evidence for anisotropy. Interestingly, and this is kind of new in this study, we were able to show that in some cases, the anisotropy lies just inside the LLSVP boundary rather than outside of it, but sometimes it looks like it's outside of it. So what might this mean? We did some modeling to try to figure out what kind of mantle flow scenarios fit our data. This is one of the successful models. This is our favorite model. In this model, we have a far away downgoing slab that is coming down, impinging on the core-mantle boundary, kind of pushing mantle flow into the edge, of the LLSVP structure. You can almost think of it as like a broom that's sort of like sweeping up this LLSVP stuff into a pile. And if we said, okay, if we take this conceptual model, we take some elastic tensors that we think are representative of the elasticity of materials at the core-mantle boundary. And if we orient them as suggested by this model, and then predict whether we would see SKS, SKKS splitting directions, this is a model that does successfully reproduce our data. Now, I want to be upfront about the fact that it's probably not a unique model. There may well be other flow scenarios that can match the data, but this is a scenario that can match our data. And this does suggest that mantle flow outside the LLSVPs might play a role in kind of shaping them into the shapes that we see today. Okay, so that's the first result to share. The second result is another study aimed at looking at flow at the base of the mantle and the possible role that subducting slabs, which are coming, again, they're sinking down from the surface and they're impinging on the core-mantle boundary, the role that these subducting slabs might play in driving flow. So this is work by a current graduate student of mine, Jonathan Wolf, and shout out to him because a lot of the results I'm going to show in the next couple minutes are his. He's looking at a couple different types of phases. One category are these SKS and SKKS phases that I already talked about. He's also looking at S waves that get diffracted along the core-mantle boundary. And these are really convenient for looking at CMB structure because they have long path lengths along the CMB. So what Jonathan did was he took a look at a small number of very high quality earthquakes that are happening here in the Western Pacific Ocean and the subduction zones there. And he measured them at a set of stations in North America. And this is where having very dense data sets comes in, because this is data from the EarthScope US array, which covered the whole of North America in seismometers. And with this very dense data set, we are able to say a lot from the waveforms that we couldn't say if we only had a couple stations. So this is just a map to give you a sense for where in the lower mantle his waves, which are traveling from the earthquakes here and being measured at the stations here in North America, this is kind of where they're sampling. So what do these waves tell us? I'm going to show you a couple slides that have wiggles on them because I'm a seismologist and I get very excited about wiggles. This is what we call a record section. So each one of these lines is a measurement from an individual seismometer. And then we put them all on one plot and they're plotted in terms of distance away from the station. And then some of them are highlighted in darker colors just so you can see, okay? Without going into the details of this, what Jonathan found is that there are some patterns in these wiggles that you would not expect unless you had lowermost mantle anisotropy. And because we had so many stations, Jonathan was able to make stacks of the data and really get very high signal to noise stacks. And what he noticed is that if you stack all of the SKS phases and look at their splitting, they don't look like they're splitting. They don't look like they've had anisotropy. There is anisotropy beneath North America, but it's so complicated that when you stack it, it kind of averages out. Whereas the SKKS waves, if you stack these, they do have this coherent signal of anisotropy, and we think that's due to the lowermost mantle. He also was able to measure the splitting of these diffracted S waves. So then he was able to take those splitting measurements. You don't need to worry too much about the details of these plots, but we have a couple seismologists in the audience, so these are our shear wave splitting measurements. And then what he did was he did some forward modeling. So he took an elastic tensor that is typical of what we think is in the lowermost mantle beneath the Northern Pacific Ocean. he said, okay, I'm going to say if this is undergoing horizontal shearing, which it probably is at this horizontal boundary layer, what are the directions of shearing that would match these splitting observations that I made? And these are the results of his models, the successful ones. The shear direction azimuth is basically what is the flow direction. And he was able to find a range of flow directions, shear directions that fit his data. And when we saw the shear direction that he came up with, we got pretty excited because it's very consistent with what you would predict if flow beneath this part of the Northern Pacific Ocean was driven by subducting slabs. So this is a region of the Earth where you've had subduction for about 200 million years. So for 200 million years, there's been oceanic lithosphere that's been sinking back down into the mantle. That's enough time for that slab material to reach the core mantle boundary. And we think what is happening is that slab material is getting down here. It's driving flow towards the south, actually towards the Pacific LLSVP. And so this is another example where we think that that subducting slabs are playing a very key role in driving flow at the base of the mantle. All right, last one I promised. This is yet another investigation of the mantle beneath the Pacific Ocean, but this is a different and even more interesting part of the mantle. So Jonathan noticed that if he looked at earthquakes here in the Tonga subduction zone, again, measured at stations of this EarthScope US array in North America, that he was able to sample the edge of the Pacific LLSVP. So I've already talked about the African LLSVP and how we think it has anisotropy at its edges. The Pacific LLSVP, it's harder to study with the technique that we used in Africa because it's under an ocean and it's hard to put seismometers in the ocean. It's not impossible, but it's hard and it's expensive. So Jonathan was very clever about the type of waves that he looked at. He's looking at shear waves that turn just above the CMB, and then again, these diffracted S waves. And he was able to get a data set that sampled the edge of the Pacific LLSVP. Very excitingly, he was looking for seismic anisotropy, and he found it. So this is the set of ray paths where he found evidence for shear wave splitting and anisotropy. He also serendipitously found one of these ULVZs, these ultra low velocity zones. So how, you ask, do you find evidence for an ultra low velocity zone in seismic data? You spend a lot of time staring at the wiggles, okay? So this is, I know there's a lot on here, but these are an example of some of the waves that he looked at. So this is, you know, a little bit of the seismogram around this direct S to S diffracted arrival. And he noticed that the data, this is the real data, and these are some synthetics for simple models. The real data showed a bunch of features that don't show up in the simple synthetics. And in particular, there are these post cursors, or there are these arrivals, small arrivals that show up after the main arrival. And we think these are from waves that are getting refracted, kind of going out of plane and then getting refracted by this very slow material and then coming back to the station. So he did a bunch of modeling to try to match these wiggles. And again, if you take a relatively simple model that doesn't have a ULVZ in it, you can't match these precursors the way they show, post cursors the way they show up. But he was able to make a model that has a ULVZ in it. And he was able to show, here's the real data now without any annotation on it. And here's his synthetic data for two different background models, but both with a ULVZ in it. And he was able to show that the only way to match these post-cursor wiggles that are showing up after the main arrival is with a ULVZ. This is extremely exciting because this means that we have a region where we've found basically co-located anisotropy, which tells us about mantle flow, as well as ULVZ material. And there are not very many places in the world where there have been observations of both of those things in the same place. And so we have a paper in review now. We are still thinking about the dynamic implications of this and where else in the world we might be able to find this. But the short answer is that we think that there is likely a role for mantle flow, which creates anisotropy, in kind of pushing around this ULVZ material at the edges of these big LLSVP structures. So stay tuned, because this is a problem that we are continuing to work on. I see I'm kind of getting towards time, and I do want to leave some time for questions. So I'm just going to skip this, but this is kind of my summary points. Just a few take homes. We do have a way to constrain flow and dynamics in the lowermost mantle using seismic observations, and particularly using observations of seismic anisotropy. We think we have multiple lines of evidence that show that subducting slabs coming down to the base of the mantle, kind of impinging on the core mantle boundary, play a key role in sort of directing mantle flow and in shaping structures, including these two large low shear velocity provinces. We also are excited about the prospect of finding co-located anisotropy and ultra low velocity zone material. And again, we think there is a role for mantle flow that in kind of transporting ULVZ material just above the core mantle boundary to its current location. So stay tuned, because that's a problem we're continuing to work on. And I would say, self-servingly, that studies of seismic anisotropy at the base of the mantle are really drastically improving our knowledge of deep mantle structure and dynamics. I am basically going to leave it there. I'm going to come back to this cartoon view, and this cartoon encapsulates a lot of things that we know, but it also suggests a bunch of questions that we don't know the answers to, and I put a bunch of those on the slides. Observations of anisotropy give us a way of getting at those questions, and I'm just very excited about this kind of new angle to think about deep earth dynamics. I am going to stop there, and I would be very happy to take questions.
I have a question.
Yes, please go ahead.
Actually, I have 4 short questions. You mentioned 3.8 billion years ago.
Yeah.
What happened then?
Good question. Basically, the rise of life. So if we're thinking about planetary habitability, so the oldest evidence for life on Earth comes from about 3.8 billion years ago.
So that would be bacteria.
Yes. So, well, yes, exactly. There are single-celled organisms. They're very simple. Complex life did not arise until more like 600 million years ago, but the earliest very simple life goes back quite far.
Right, right. Yeah. Secondly, the heat in the center of the Earth, is that mostly due to the decay of radioactive elements or something else?
Great question. It is due to a combination of the decay of radioactive elements, but also, and probably more importantly, it's essentially primordial heat left over from Earth's formation. So, Earth was formed by the accretion of a bunch of small planetesimals. Those collisions were very energetic. They generated heat, and it's basically heat left over from the formation of the Earth that's slowly being lost to space. So those are kind of the two sources, and the primordial heat is probably the more important one.
I see. I thought it was the reverse, but I'm probably wrong.
In the crust, radiogenic heat production is very important, but yeah.
Well, what about the magnetic field moving? What's the story there?
Yep. So the magnetic field is due to the geodynamo. So this is convection currents in the Earth's liquid iron, metallic core. So that convection in that liquid region acts as a dynamo, generates the magnetic field. Because the viscosity of the outer core is much lower than the viscosity of the mantle by like tens of orders of magnitude, those convection currents in the core happen much faster than convection in the mantle. And that explains why the Earth's magnetic field varies on very short length scale. I mean, like we measure year to year the variations in the Earth's magnetic field.
Okay, great. And I'm just going to say that if people in the room have questions, you can raise your hand and speak up. The mics will pick it up. And then I'll try to also, if you're on Zoom, if you could just raise your hand or unmute and let me know that you have a question. So questions in the room. Yeah, Grant, speak up.
Thank you. Those ultra low velocity zones, is there any, could they possibly be associated with melt? And if they're associated, if they are associated with melt, have there been studies looking into seeing if they could be associated with subduction zones, melting the mantle at the bottom, like subduction of the bypass melt mantle.
Yes, fantastic question. So there are a few ideas out there for what the ULVZs might be. And one is that they're zones with very high concentrations of partial melt. So you're absolutely right, melt, seismic waves go very slow, travel very slowly through partially molten regions. And so one idea is that they are partially molten. There are some dynamic challenges with that in the sense that melt typically does not have the same buoyancy, the same density as what's around it. So if you have some partial melt, you might expect that melt to drain. And so then why is it in like 20-kilometer thick layers? So there's some discussion about sort of the dynamic plausibility of that, but that is one of the leading candidates. There are also ideas about you might have core, like infiltration of core materials, that you might have like iron infiltration into the base of the mantle. That's been put out there as a hypothesis. Another hypothesis is that you might have, depending on the composition, the exact composition of the minerals at the base of the mantle, if you have regions that are a little more iron rich, say, that can drastically change the elastic moduli. So there might be variations in the composition of individual minerals. So one model that's been proposed says ferropericlase, which is about 20% by volume. If you have a lot of iron in the crystal structure, then it might be very slow. So these are the ideas that are out there. All of them have very important dynamic implications, as you kind of alluded to in your question. And it is a very active area of research figuring out which of these, if any, is the right description for what ULVZs are. And we're certainly hoping that getting a better idea of how they interact dynamically with the rest of the mantle might speak to that question.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. It's a great question. I'm glad you asked it.
More questions? Anybody on Zoom by any chance?
I'm happy to take general questions about, earth science, geophysics too. Now's your chance if you're wondering.
I have a question just related to, so if the ULVZs, the ultra low velocity zones, are some sort of melt rich region, wouldn't you expect there to be a lot of attenuation of seismic waves? So can one get at the physical state by looking at seismic attenuation maps?
It's an excellent question. So yeah, so if there's partial melt, one effect is that it'll make the seismic velocities lower, but the other effect is that it'll make for much higher seismic attenuation. And just for everybody, when we talk about attenuation, we're talking about the non-elastic part, like basically the loss of the elastic energy to heat, right? So we would absolutely expect seismic waves to attenuate more quickly in partially molten regions. And we see that all the time in the upper mantle where we have regions of melting. The challenge with ULVZs is that they're very small structures, and it's not clear that, to what extent the attenuation of a wave that is sensitive to like a pretty big volume of mantle is going to be affected by this very small, small thing. So that's one challenge. The other thing is that amplitudes are tricky. There are a bunch of things that affect seismic amplitudes other than real attenuation. You have scattering, you have multipathing. And I think especially when you're working with waves that target the lowermost mantle, which is already a really complicated region, it gets hard to look at attenuation. And the reason I say this is because we've actually tried. One of these data sets, I think it was the second of the three that I showed, Jonathan sort of serendipitously found the evidence for anisotropy, but we actually started out trying to look at attenuation and found that it was very tricky to do. So it's potentially it's quite challenging.
Yes, Tim.
In the final slide that you had up,
Mhm.
I understand I'm not an expert in this business at all.
This one
Uh,
or this one.
Are you sharing, Maureen?
Oh, I should be. Oh,
Just share content.
can you still see my screen or no?
No, hold on.
Yeah.
Right here? Yeah. Okay, there we go. Now we see your
Now you see it. Okay. Is it this one or a different one?
Yes, this is the one.
Okay, perfect.
I was trying to understand where the words seismic reflections appear.
Yeah,
Obvious, beautiful, what I would just call a plume, or I mean, it's like an explosion cloud, if you will, but
Yeah.
that
Yep.
image is a cartoon as opposed to the thing on the right, which is either data or at least from a model. What is the significance of the fact that there's a plumey thing on top of an LSVP? Does that mean you know something about? I'm not sure what that.
Yeah. No, that's a fantastic question. So a couple of points. So one is, yeah, you're absolutely right. You know, this is a cartoon that is lightly inspired by these observations over here on the right, which suggests this area of fast stuff, which sort of suggests a slab, and this area of slow stuff, which is the LLSVP. You're absolutely right that this kind of plume here off the top of the LLSVP, and certainly this plume off the side of the LLSVP, these are kind of artist renditions. They're not directly visible in this. Maybe there's a hint of this one, but they're not directly visible in this tomography model. Now, we do have an idea that plumes get generated at the edges of these LLSVPs, and that comes from, you know, like that figure that I showed in map view, where you map where the LLSVPs are that we see with tomography, and then you map where we have hotspot volcanism coming out at the surface, like in Hawaii. And many of those do fall on the edges of the LLSVPs. So that's sort of what suggests this idea that we might have plumes coming from the LLSVP edges. Now, having said that, it would be nice to have, as a seismologist, I think it would be nice to have real confirmation of that in that idea in our seismic imaging. And I think we're kind of getting there. Plumes are notoriously difficult to image seismically because at least the classical version of a Rayleigh-Taylor instability coming off the core-mantle boundary, they're pretty thin and they're also slow. So seismic waves tend to get refracted away from them rather than towards them. So it's hard to directly image them, but there are some indirect things that we can do. And actually one of the things that we've done with anisotropy is to try to look beneath mantle plumes and see if we see direct evidence for vertical mantle flow, which might be kind of like a smoking gun that, like, yes, indeed, there is an upwelling originating from the core-mantle boundary here beneath the plume. So you've asked a very good question about, like, what in here is an artist's sort of rendition and where does that come from versus what is actually in the observations.
Thank you.
I think there's a question on Zoom.
Yes.
Yes, yeah, I have a question about can we infer anisotropy strength of the lowermost mantle from shear wave splitting?
Yeah,
So
the question is, like, can you distinguish anisotropy at the base of the mantle from shear wave splitting? Is that
yes, I just wondering because I know that from the class and upper mantle we can infer the seismic anisotropy strength with some assumptions from the measurement of the shear wave splitting. I just wondering if we can also do this from the lowermost mantle also.
I see. So you're asking especially about the strength of anisotropy.
Yeah.
Yeah, got it. Yep. So we can say something about the strength of anisotropy. You know, we can measure the shear wave splitting delay times due to anisotropy at the base of the mantle, and those tell us about a combination of the strength of anisotropy and the thickness of the layer. So that unfortunately we have the same trade-off between anisotropy strength and layer thickness that we have for the upper mantle, but we can estimate the delay times and then say something about the strength of anisotropy. Now, parenthetically, because you've sort of brought it up, I want to say for the audience, and this is a point that I pretty much completely elided during my talk, all of the measurements that we make of lowermost mantle anisotropy, we always have to worry about what's going on in the upper mantle. And one of the reasons this is hard is because all these waves pass through the upper mantle, which we know has anisotropy. So you always have to account for that upper mantle contribution. And in everything that I've shown, we've done that, at least to the best of our ability. Now, to say something about what we think those anisotropy strengths are, which is the heart of your question. In general, they're pretty comparable to what we think is present in the upper mantle. A few percent, say 3%, 5%, sometimes in that, something in that range. The splitting delay times are off that we attribute to the lowermost mantle. They're pretty comparable to what we see in the upper mantle. So in general, like a few percent anisotropy is enough to explain the observations.
Okay, thank you.
Further questions? So it seems that the lower mantle is at least as heterogeneous as the upper mantle.
It is, yep.
Ways we don't yet understand.
Yeah, it's just harder to study. Like it's probably, you walk around on the surface and we see all this rich, complicated geology at the surface. It's probably just as complicated at the core-mantle boundary. It's just harder to study. Yeah.
So I do want to say for everyone in the audience and those on Zoom, I've been watching an exchange with the colloquium committee. It seems that the link was broken on the web and it's now being fixed. There was some issue because the last few colloquia were run from someone's personal account and not the Panda account. So I apologize, but the committee says that from here on out, things should be fixed. So hopefully, I'm so sorry that there were those glitches, but hopefully from here on out, things will be fixed. So with that, I'd love to thank Maureen, and I wish that you were here.
I know, me too. But thank you very much for having me virtually.
Yeah, and I also want to say that Maureen, because she comes from a physics background and gave such a great talk to the physics audience, if any of you students have questions, I hope I can volunteer, but I think Maureen would be open to answering some of these.
That goes for anybody. If you have additional follow-ups or questions or just want to chat about any of this stuff, please. I will talk science anytime with anybody. So hit me up.
All right, thank you again.
Thanks very much for having me. Thanks so much.
Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.